Welcome back, everybody. We have a lot of trials to talk about here on the network. We're going to be live in 3 different courtrooms, but right now we got to talk about something else that we covered here on the Law and Crime Networks. For weeks, we covered the trial against Steven Burgoyne. This was that Vermont man who was accused of 5 counts of second-degree murder for driving his SUV at a high rate of speed on the wrong side of a highway and colliding with a car full of 5 teenagers, ultimately killing all of them. Now, he claimed a defense of insanity. But the question is, did the jury buy it? Well, his verdict came down last week. Let's see.
With respect to the affirmative defense of insanity, did the jury conclude that the defendant had failed to meet his burden of proof with regard to insanity?
Yes.
And was that decision unanimous?
Yes.
So say you all?
Yes.
With regard to count 2, the charge involving the second-degree murder of Cyrus Shao, how did the jury find?
We found it charged guilty of second-degree murder.
Was that verdict unanimous?
Yes.
With regard to count 3, the second-degree murder involving Liam Hale, how did the jury find?
Found Mr. Bourgoin guilty of second-degree murder.
And was that verdict unanimous?
Yes.
With regard to count 4, the second-degree murder involving Janie Kazi, how did the jury find?
We found Mr. Bourgoin guilty of second-degree murder.
And was that verdict unanimous?
Yes.
With regard to count 5, the second-degree murder of Eli Brookins, how did the jury find?
We found Mr. Bourgoin guilty of second-degree murder.
And was that verdict unanimous?
Yes.
In docket 37981016, with regard to count 1, the gross negligent operation of a motor vehicle, how did you find?
We found Mr. Bourgoin guilty of grossly negligent operation of a vehicle.
And was that verdict unanimous?
Yes, it was.
And with regard to count 2, the aggravated operation of a vehicle without the owner's consent, how did the jury find?
We found Steve Burgoyne guilty.
And was that verdict unanimous?
Yes.
Guilty across the board, 7 counts. And joining me right now to discuss this case is the woman who prosecuted Bourgoin, Sarah George. Great to have you here on Law and Crime.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I want you to go back to that courtroom. You're sitting there, you're waiting for the verdict. It's so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. You hear the guilty verdict, the first one. What's your reaction? What are you thinking?
So much relief. That trial was a long time coming, and those verdicts were a long time coming. I don't think I've ever felt such a physical relief in my life. Really, just the weight of that whole case had been on my shoulders for so long that in that moment was the first time in 2.5 years that I've felt like my shoulders were able to relax and some of that weight was relieved.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, you put a lot of time and energy into this, and you say the pressure. I'm assuming you also mean the family, trying to show justice to the family, the victims' family members. I mean, what was your reaction when the verdict came down? I think you were hugging them. I mean, can you explain that a little bit about what were they feeling when these verdicts handed down? You see this right here.
Yeah, I mean, the same. I think for them, this process has been so long, and there's been so many conversations about this insanity defense, and I try as a prosecutor to give families of victims some comfort in our system. But at the end of the day, when it's up to a jury and it's sort of out of my hands, you also have to prep them for another alternative or another outcome. And so they've been struggling with that as well. And that worry of whether or not the jury would find that he met his burden and found him insane. And so I think for them that it was that same level of relief of just not knowing for so long what the outcome was going to be, and then in that moment knowing that knowing what it was.
Yeah, so many times it's just impossible to predict what a jury will ultimately do, even no matter how strong or weak a case is. But I got to ask you, the insanity defense here raised a little bit of questions. Was there any point during this trial when you said, okay, maybe they have something here. They might be able to convince, not if the whole jury, but at least one jury member, we might have a mistrial on our hands. Did you ever think about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like you said, you just never know. I gave up a long time ago trying to predict what a jury would do and why they would do it. And so it would have been naive of me to not think about it. I never felt like the defense was valid. I never felt like the burden had been filled, but you certainly wonder if a jury is going to think that. I mean, I'm thinking about it from a very legal perspective, and
well, let's talk about it from a legal perspective. The idea of a guy who thought or allegedly thought that these teenagers were mannequins, thinking the radio was talking to him, thought he was part of a government conspiracy. I mean, the very idea of stealing a police cruiser and driving it away from a crime scene and then ultimately driving it back, doesn't that raise an idea of, well, maybe this guy was in fact insane?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from my perspective, there's always been another reasonable explanation that makes a lot more sense than the fact that he thought that his radio was talking to him. And that's what we needed to just really stress to the jury of, like, everybody wants to imagine that there's some reasonable explanation for these things. And anybody who commits murder in some sense has some mental health issue going on or some other reason that they might find was valid at the time. That doesn't make them insane. I mean, the insanity defense is a very difficult burden for the defense. And in some cases, it's a very valid one. And in this one, we just felt like there was a lot of other reasons why he just stole a car and took off. And then when he was trapped, came back. And just showing that to the jury.
Right. And so maybe the question is not if he suffered from mental disease or defect. Maybe that one everyone can agree on. But then are you saying that perhaps he was making up the symptoms in order to get that insanity defense? We hear it a lot, of big term. It's called malingering. Is that what you thought he might have been doing throughout this case?
I actually never really had a strong feeling about that one way or the other, whether he was making it up. But once I started to prepare for trial and spoke at length with Dr. Cotton and some of the other just legal experts in this field, my theory is that after this occurred, in that moment when he did see these teenagers in the car, his mind immediately started to defend itself. And I think that at some point, Mr. Burgoyne may actually believe that he felt these things. But I do think that it was a sort of psychological game that his mind may have been playing to convince himself that he couldn't possibly have done this otherwise. I think that our minds do really incredible things to try to make ourselves feel better about bad decisions that we make, and I think that's what happened.
Well, what about the experts that were called by the defense, who in their opinion, they thought he was legally insane? What did you make of their testimony?
I thought that they made their decisions based on the information they had and when they had it. And I think that when you look at the two people that interacted with him nearly 2 years after the event, have a pretty similar view of the case, where every other person who interacted with Mr. Burgoyne, including professionals and psychiatrists in the days before and days after, didn't see any of the things that the experts are relying on. So I never found their opinions to be valid, given the evidence that I knew was going to come out in trial, which they didn't necessarily know how that was going to play out. They didn't talk to a lot of the witnesses. Reading a deposition of a witness and basing an opinion on that, I mean, is what they had to go with. I'm not faulting them for that, but that's very different than when that person comes in and testifies to a jury. And I had met with those people. I'd been there in person and heard their input, and I knew the jury was going to find them credible.
Sure. It is a danger. And look, I get it, the back and forth between the prosecution and defense. It's always interesting to see, especially in insanity cases. But here, I don't think your fight is over quite yet, because his team says they plan to appeal. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in Vermont, it's an automatic appeal for anybody who is facing a life sentence. So that was certainly not surprising to me. We have, as issues would come up during trial, we would immediately go to our appellate division and start talking to them about whether this was a valid appellate issue. and if it was a valid appellate issue, what we could do to avoid it. And if that meant, giving in to the defense on an issue that we thought we might lose on appeal, we gave in to the defense.
Right.
So I feel very strongly going into the appellate process that we caved when we needed to make sure that any conviction was upheld, and on things that we felt strongly about, given our case law in Vermont, we went forward with, and we'll take our chances with the Supreme Court. But
Right.
I'm not concerned about it.
Well, look, you seem ready for the next chapter, and I got to ask you, final question. What are you going to recommend in terms of sentence for Mr. Burgoyne? Because I know that's going to be a next issue.
Yeah, I don't know yet. I want to meet with all the families and get their input, but I don't take lightly that Mr. Burgoyne faces life in jail. I also recognize that he made the decisions he made that night, and they've had countless ripple effects of trauma in this community and in this state. But he didn't know there was 5 teenagers in that car when he hit it. And, so I need to make sure that my sentence is consistent with other cases that maybe didn't involve 5 teenagers, but also balancing that with the fact that that's a risk he took and that's the car he hit. But I don't know yet. I want the number to mean something.
Sure.
I don't want it to just be an arbitrary number that you put on someone's life. But I don't know what that is yet.
I'll tell you what, we're going to be following it. I'll tell you that much. And Sarah George, thanks so much for coming on. Congratulations on the case. We look forward to seeing the next chapter. And thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. All right, everybody, let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover.